Point number 4, if you look at this CBO, the Congressional Budget Office estimates of what U.S. public debt is going to be as a share of GDP or even external debt, they show that U.S. public debt with budget deficit this year of 7% and being closer to 5-6 for the next few years is on an unsustainable path. Eventually, it's going to be going all the way even towards 150% of GDP. And people worry when that's going to be the case, eventually something is going to happen. Market discipline with spread widening. We might need to monetize it. We're not going to have debt default because U.S. can monetize it. But they say it's unsustainable. But what is the assumption that the CBO makes about U.S. potential growth? The assumption is that U.S. potential growth is only, for the next 2 decades, 1.8%. So not very different from what the potential growth has been in the last 20 years. However, the CBO does a scenario analysis where they say, let's assume, just hypothetically, the U.S. potential growth is not 1.8%, but is 2.3%, just 50 basis points higher, an epsilon greater than that. Then what happens to public debt to GDP? It goes up for the next 20 years somehow, and then it flattens out. Because, of course, debt to GDP is debt relative to GDP. If GDP is growing faster, the denominator, then the ratio is going to flatten out, and the deficit is going to shrink over time. Now, this is flattening out in 20 years if the potential growth is 2.3. If it's not 2.3, but 2.5, 3%, 3.5, let alone 4, then, of course, the ratio is going to fall over time quite sharply. Now, you might say, well, we have a bias towards spending. If the deficit is going to shrink, the political system is going to lead to eventually spending more. That's a risk. Or we could say that eventually, with permanent technological employment coming from AI, we have to widen the social safety net, maybe UBI, and unless we tax the winners to redistribute to everybody else, the deficit could go larger. Fair enough. Those are valid points. But the point is that given the current trajectory of policy, the debt to GDP ratio doesn't explode in a world in which growth is 3. Of all the solutions to a debt problem, as we know, debt of a household, debt of a firm, debt of a country, domestic or external, the best solution is to grow the denominator, income, revenue, profits, GDP. And therefore, if you have a more optimistic scenario about US growth, then the concerns about the sustainability of public debt or even external debt are not as severe. Guess what? The 10-year Treasury is still at 4%. Why is it so low? In spite of this concern about the deficit, maybe because people realize we are on a different growth path. So I'm not saying we don't have fiscal problem, but compared to those of countries like Europe, where potential growth is 1% of GDP, and unless they innovate, they're going to stagnate at 1%, I think the problems of Europe are more severe than the United States or Japan, for example, in terms of that sustainability.